Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming in. 8:30 on the last day of Dreamforce. I was kind of expecting an empty room, but thanks for coming. Welcome to my session, Interactive Lightning Components using the Reports and Dashboards API. Just to get a quick pulse of the room, how many developers we have in here? Cool, and then how many admins? And then none of the above? Cool, I think we have a little bit of something for everyone. Before we start, let me just introduce myself. My name is Sean Cuevo. I have been in software development for 6 years now. I actually started out as an accountant and turned out that's not what I like to do. Just moved into software development with Ruby on Rails and then somehow stumbled into Salesforce development. I feel like that's the common theme with most people in Salesforce. You don't really choose Salesforce, it kind of chooses you. And I moved into consulting. Worked for an ISV for a while, and then now I'm on the industry side, working at in higher ed tech. So that's giving me a chance to do a lot of Salesforce, some exposure in JavaScript, Golang, and Python. You kind of get the whole gamut when you're working with Salesforce as you try to integrate with other systems. So that's been great. Currently, I'm the senior Salesforce developer at a company called Guild Education based in Denver, Colorado. Guild is redefining higher education and the future of work for 64 million Americans. Our students first approach is helping millions of working adults advance their careers through education. And Salesforce plays a large role in helping us reach our goals. If anyone wants to talk about Guild or just anything in general after the session, I'd love to sync up. So let's talk about our agenda today. First, we're going to talk about the troubles with navigating and working with data, especially in aggregate. And then we'll talk about the options we have out of the box. I'll introduce a topic that I like to call configuration-driven development. We'll dive into some code, and we'll get some code samples so that you can get your feet wet in some Lightning development. So data can be hard to navigate. A common theme I've seen is we have aggregate data views, like list views and reports, to figure out what we should work on. And then we have detail pages to actually work on those records. A common workflow that I've seen is you have your list view to tell you these are the records I'm going to look at today. You open up a record on a new tab and then work on that record, close that tab, go back to your list view, just close out your list view, and then go to the next list view you have a report. And while it works, it's a little tedious. You should consider every click as bad and every page load as even worse. When it comes to designing user experience, if you ever have to make your user click or you have to make them load a page, slap yourself in the face so that you have an idea of what it feels like to be them. It seems extreme, right? But how many of you in here have users that just will not give up their spreadsheets? Yeah, I see a lot of hands in here. Like, same thing at every place I've worked at. I've worked at several companies, and there's always some rogue people that are working out of spreadsheets instead of Salesforce. And when it comes to reporting time, they're rushing to get everything into Salesforce from their spreadsheets. But I totally get it. Excel or Google spreadsheets, they're so easy, so intuitive, so fast to use. We have an accountant on our team at Guild, and when he uses his spreadsheets, it's like he's playing the piano. It's just like going back and forth in tabs, editing rows, and he's so fast. It just feels so good to him. And that's what you're competing with when you're building a user experience within Salesforce. Imagine every time you had to edit a row in Excel, you had to open up another Excel file to edit it, and then save and go back to another one. So you have to somehow beat the convenience of an Excel sheet with the value that you would get out of getting something into Salesforce. And so this is the use case that we faced with our admissions advisors at Guild Education. They said, as an admissions advisor, I'd like to see the sources of my leads as they progress through the funnel in one place so that I can plan out my calls and my day more efficiently. Now, this is kind of the ideal, the situation when someone comes to you with the problem they want, not, hey, can you add a pick list value? Can you just build this page for me? So getting to this point is a little tricky, but once you get here, you have an idea of what you'll need to do. And so what are our options? When it came up to me, I said, okay, what can we do? All right, we can build a list view. They're very easy to configure, quick to build. They allow for inline editing to some extent. There are some fields that don't work, and you have to filter by a record type. They're also available as Lightning components, so you can just embed them on a Lightning app and have multiple at once. Unfortunately, it's not for all objects, like tasks. I believe you can't do that for, but for the most part, you can do it. And one other problem is that you're limited to one level of data, that you can't view its children. And reports also share some of these ease of use and easiness to build, and they also allow for multiple levels of objects. However, they're uneditable. And also, you can't actually embed them in a Lightning component. You can embed the chart, but not the report itself, which is kind of what they wanted. They wanted to see, oh, here are all the people that I need to call, and these are the activities that I had logged already. And of course, as a developer, my first instinct is, I can build that so fast. I'm the best developer. It's to build something super customizable just for you. And really, yeah, that's the cool thing about Salesforce and custom development, that it really is limited to whatever you can do. However, you become the bottleneck as a result, and it can be very expensive to maintain, to deploy. My deployments right now take about an hour to run through all the tests. That's actually like one of the faster orgs I've seen. I've worked in orgs where it took 6 hours just to run all the tests, and you just prayed that it went through. You didn't have any failing components. So when I was approaching this problem, when I thought that I should build a custom Lightning component, I kept going back to the idea that the report is so close. It gets me 80% of the way there. If I could just embed a report in a Lightning component, I'd be good to go, because I just embed the report, and they can configure it as much as they want. And so doing something custom with Lightning seemed like it would get me there, but it seemed really heavy-handed to have to build something out just because I couldn't get around a reporting restriction. And so this is where I got the idea of configuration-driven development. I think this really applies to Salesforce because there's so much you can do declaratively on the front end. For example, you can have process builders that fire Apex. So instead of trying to write a trigger, you could actually build a process that fires some Apex to handle the business logic. You could also leverage other pieces of the API that are configurable in your Apex code. For example, a common use case was, I want to view a bunch of rows in aggregate, but I don't know what columns to display, and I know it's going to change often. So I use field sets to just dynamically grow a table. Custom metadata types have, in the last couple years, replaced custom settings. If you're familiar with either, they're really just a special kind of S object that allows you to persist, for the lack of a better term, settings that can be leveraged by your code to do more dynamic work. For example, I've used custom metadata types to store credentials and for callouts, to hold field set labels so I can dynamically call a field set based on an object. And the great thing about custom metadata types is they persist between sandboxes, so you don't have to keep configuring them, unlike just a regular standard S object. And also list views. List views actually spit out the SOCL query it uses if you ping the metadata API, which I just learned about a couple of months ago. It was like a nice surprise for me, because someone wanted a list view, but also the notes that went with those objects. And so it's like, oh, I have the SOCL query. I'll just also query the notes that are attached to it, and now I have a list view that has records with their notes. The piece of configuration that I want to focus on today are the design attributes in Lightning. These allow for a greater amount of configuration on the front end, allowing you to customize your components and make maintenance really easy without having to touch your code. These design attributes are the things you see on the right-hand side of the Lightning App Builder when you select an application, or select a component for your Lightning application. The cool thing about these is that they're accessible via JavaScript and Apex, so you can write dynamic functionality. So on the top there, I have the report ID, which is what we're going to use to later. And that report ID was configured by that design component on the bottom. So that design component lets me configure what appears on the front end. And then the component then passes that information to your JavaScript and your Lightning component, which can then pass it to your Apex. So for developers out there, just remember design components. That's where you look for to add these things. And for your admins, just remember the design component, design attributes, pass it to your developers. They'll Google it and figure it out. So in this example, I use a report ID, but you could also use field set names, filter criteria, basically anything you can put in a string. And you can have more than one. So you're not limited to just one attribute. You can just keep adding attributes in that component and just have n number of configurable values. So knowing all of this, knowing that we could configure a Lightning component on the front end with this report ID, and then knowing that the reports and dashboards API gives me all this information, then if I decided to build some kind of custom Lightning component that uses the reports and dashboards API to get the data I actually want to display, and the component that I would build would actually handle the rendering of that report. The great thing about this is now I have a component that is configurable. If I build one generic component, I can just pass it whatever report ID and it works for me. So that being the case, I was like, okay, and now I need to use the reports and dashboards API. And this was actually the first time I ever had to use it. And when so I had to figure out what it spit out. So I went into the developer console, went into execute anonymous, pinged the reports and dashboard API with an ID and try to figure out, all right, what am I getting here? Because you need to build to the data provided. Of course, I could just write a SQL query or just and filter it the way I wanted, but then I lose the value that I would get with the dashboards API. So I needed to understand what I could and I could not control. And then who in here has actually used the reports and dashboards API before? So you're probably familiar with the JSON that it spits out, and it's a doozy. It's not ideal. What I expected was just a JSON object with like a grouping of data, and then under that would be the rows related to it, or if there's another grouping, it'd have a grouping, and then the rows, and then maybe another piece that had all the labels. No, it's just one giant, flat JSON object. I mean, there's some tiers, but it's very flat. And let's take a look at what that looks like. Here are some of the highlights on that JSON structure. First is the header info. The first thing here is the grouping column info. You're going to want to look for that key when you're taking a look at that JSON. And this gives you the summary labels. And they're displayed in reverse order of how they're actually grouped. So in this example, we have company and lead source. But I'm actually grouping by lead source and then by company. So that was a little unintuitive at first. And also you'll notice that it only says what the labels are for. I'm getting the lead source, but it doesn't show what the lead sources are or what those companies are. This is kind of just metadata for your groupings. And the other piece is the detail column info. These are the actual columns that are being displayed on your report. Here you see I'm displaying email, and then there would be a list of all the other columns in the JSON. Again, still just metadata for the report. We don't have a list of emails. It's actually just the header email. The next piece is the grouping info. This grouping info doesn't live underneath the header info. It's actually just another key after the header info. So what you'll want to look for is this key groupings. These are the values of the fields you grouped by in your report. So for example, remember, I started with lead source and company name. So that's why you see that the value is web, and then under that is the label is company, is the company that is for that grouping. And they are grouped recursively. So as you have more groupings, they'll just keep tiering down. So a grouping has a grouping has a grouping. Eventually there'll be no more groupings because you can only group by, I think it's 3 levels. And then it'll stop, and then that's when you know to display the rows. The last piece to remember here is this key. We're going to need this key to find the rows associated to this grouping. Remember, I still don't have the row data yet. This is just the labels for the groupings. So this key, remember that syntax. In here, it's 0 underscore 0. So it's a number, an underscore, and another number. And that'll help you find out where is this key. And the key will come into play on this side. We finally get to the row info under this key called FactMap. And the FactMap, again, is not under the grouping info. It's just its own key on the outermost part of the JSON. The FactMap contains mappings of the keys from the last slide and the rows from this slide. So you'll notice there that the key is 1 underscore 0 bang T. So that first part, that 1 underscore 0 is what's going to map to the key in the grouping info. And for some reason, they put that bang T afterwards. I'm sure there's some programmatic reason why Salesforce decided to do that, but just remember that that exists there. So it's not going to map 1 to 1. You're going to have to account for the fact that that bang T is appended to the end of the key. And finally, we get to our actual row data. So with that key, now we can map these rows with the groupings that they're grouped with. So now that we had all of these parts, I needed to plan our component out. I could have just built one giant component that had everything, but that kind of misses the point with the component-based architecture of Lightning. So it seemed to me that these were the 3 components that made the most sense to me. First, I had the report container. This kind of just contains the report itself. It's a top-level interface, and its job is mainly just to hold the report itself and also fetch all the report data from our controller so that I can feed it to the children components. The next part, highlighted in green, is the report grouping. These are each of those groupings that I covered that show the levels of the groups. They won't display the actual row data, but each grouping will hold either another child grouping or the rows itself. And the last piece in the purple is the grouping data cells, or you can also think of this as the actual row data. This will display the actual data from that row key after it's mapped to the appropriate report grouping. And also I have to make sure that it grows dynamically based on the number of columns from the report. So let's take a look at some code, and then we'll at the actual component itself. The first thing I wanted to point out is the Apex controller that I have. It's very short. All it is one line of actual code that all it does is it fetches the report based on a report ID passed in from the Lightning controller. Notice that it is Aura enabled, and that allows to expose this controller method to the JavaScript controller in your Lightning component. But all I do here is call the reports API. So it reports that report manager, that run report, pass it the report ID. That spits out an object, and then I serialize it into JSON so that I can send it to the front end. Here is the actual design component itself. Design component, again, just holds the report ID. This is saying, all right, I want you to expose this to the front end so that we can enter a value when this Lightning component is added to an app. So this label, this is what you'll see on the front end. This name, this is what you'll use on the controller side as a merge field. And then if we jump into the actual container, of the markup for the component, you'll see here it has an attribute called report ID attribute. That attribute links to the design attribute. So again, on the front end, you have that report ID. Then you pass in that report ID to the design attribute. That design attribute links to this component attribute. And then now we can access this report ID within our controller. So that's the report ID. This appears again here in our controller. So that's how we access it. So let's go back to the component itself and take a look at what's going on here. Now, at the end of the presentation, I have a link both to the GitHub repo that holds this and also the the unmanaged package so you can download it. So I commented all the codes so that you can actually go through it yourself. But I figured let's take a quick look of what's going on here. Really, here, this is just a spinner to show that it's loading while it's trying to get that data. This div holds an error div, basically saying if the report's not available for whatever reason, just display an error to contact your admin. And this holds the actual report data itself. You'll notice in here, there's nothing very specific to any one report. It just expects a structure of that reporting JSON and then displays it based on what it gets. Here, this header just shows the link to the report so that if you click on it, it goes to the report link, the actual standard report in Salesforce. This nice lightning button icon, it's a nice freebie you get from the icon library in the Lightning design system. That's just a refresh button so that I can refresh the report whenever I need. Then we get into the actual table. In the table header, I just display all the column labels. And then in the table body, this recursively displays groupings downwards to keep recursing until we find the row data. So if there are groupings, if you do have a summary report, it would call this report grouping component, and then that would handle displaying a grouping. If there were no groupings, for example, it's just a regular tabular report or just a summary report with no groupings in it, then this grouping data would be null, and so we should just display this grouping data cells or the rows themselves. This function here is the getReport function that gets called on initialization of the component. And basically, it just falls into a few steps, just like hide the different various components. So show the loading component, hide the report itself so they don't see a blank, just like a big blank page. Here we call our report, our controller method, the Apex controller method. You can tell it's the Apex controller method because it starts with C. One quick gotcha here is if you name this getReport instead of getReport metadata, if this name here is the same as this name here, it would actually try to call the controller method, and the JavaScript controller method is supposed to be the Apex one. So just a little gotcha there. So just make sure that your method names are unique. And then this sets that parameter for a report ID. That, again, this gets that report ID from that design attribute. And then we have our callback for what to do when we get a response from our controller. I don't want to get too into this because it's a lot of taking that flat hierarchy of data and then making it hierarchical. So if you want, I would suggest just diving into this code on your own and trying to piece together how it works, because it's a lot of taking those keys, all right, finding the key in the rows, and then mapping that to that key. It's a lot of just making it into that hierarchical data structure that would be more convenient to work with in the front end. And then lastly, if anything goes wrong, we'll hide the loading spinner and show the report error. And then as we deep dive into the next level, the actual report grouping, similar logic here, just some handlers to handle when we load the component to set all the labels. Here we're going to just display the groupings themselves. There's a lot going on here, but mainly there's a little hack in here, especially on this line, trying to figure out if it's a lookup field or not. In a report, you want to be able to click on a related record if it displays in the report. So in this case, if the grouping value doesn't equal the grouping label, meaning it's like the name of the company and then the value is the actual ID of that company, then I'm going to assume that it's an ID that we can link to. And if it's 15 or 18 digits, then display it as a link. Otherwise, just show the label. And here's where we continue to recurse downwards. So again, we check on the groupings, see if they're null or not. And if it isn't null, then show it the next grouping. Otherwise, just render the grouping data cells. And then the data cells are kind of similar as well. Display a link to the record if it's 15 or 18 digits. Display the label if it's not. And then these will be the actual data rows. OK, so let's get out of here and take a look at the final product. So here it is. This the standard looks like a regular classic report. I couldn't get it to look like the new reporting structure that Lightning uses, but this works well enough. So we have here just all leads. This is the chart that would get spit out by this. This is the standard component. This is the custom one. And now you can just work on your queue from here. And a nice little bonus here is that you click on this pencil. This is a lookup field. It's like, oh, I want to edit the lead that is on this page. Click on that, and you can just work on the record straight from here. No page load, no slap in the face, and you can just have a nicer experience. What makes this really powerful is how you are able to configure it. A requirement that you're probably going to get when presented with this is, oh, I need to call them, but if they're not there, I want to send them a follow-up email. Can you add email to the report? If this were a standard, not a standard, a custom Visualforce or Lightning component that I just hard-coded, I would have to then go into the code, add the phone number, maybe write a test, or add the email, maybe write a test, and then deploy it. So like a minimum of at least an hour, because it takes an hour for me to deploy anything. But in this case, I can just go to the report, hit edit. Let's add the email. Oops. Save that. All right, that's saved. Go back here. I'll refresh my report, and boom, there it is. Now you have your email as well. Notice I didn't even have to refresh the page. Like I refreshed the component itself because it's just getting the JSON from the server. Oh, thank you for the applause. No, I mean, you don't have to clap, but thank you. So that's pretty much it with the demo. So let's recap. Don't code if you don't have to. If you don't have to hard code anything, if there's a standard way to do it, if there's something out of the box, or if you can even just buy something, you want to do that first. Because even if you're the best developer, you don't want to become the bottleneck. Because when something goes wrong, they have to go get you to fix it. And also now here's another thing you have to maintain. And if you have to build with a configurable mindset. In this case, we built something with a report ID. But what if you also did something with the list views? Or what if you took this to its logical, crazy conclusion and you just never wrote a SOQL query again? You just always use reports. The report API limits you to about 2,000 records you can view at once. But it gives you all the filters and all that data. You could technically build a SOQL builder with a report. And lastly, break your solution down into modular parts. The reason I broke this down into 3 components instead of one large one is if I wanted to change one of the components, I didn't have to change the other ones. They all kind of follow a contract of what they would pass to each other. But as long as you stick to that contract, you can switch them out as needed. For example, with the grouping data cells, I learned about Lightning Data Service this week. And what if instead of just displaying the records, I hooked it up to Lightning Data Service and you could make it editable in line as opposed to even opening up a modal? And then if I followed the contract, I wouldn't have to change the report container or the report grouping. I just had to change that one component. So here's some resources for you. Here's the GitHub link to all the code we saw today. If you want to install the package, you can just go to that link there. I also added a link to the Lightning Design System. If you can, use the Lightning Design System when you're building Lightning components. It gives you a lot of free stuff, and it makes it pretty seamless with the design of Lightning. And of course, take a look at the Reports and Dashboards API. It's a doozy. That was probably the hardest part of this project because I had to figure out how to build to that API. I'll also post the slides in the chatter group that's attached to this to the session, but I figure just take a picture of this now if you want that link, in case I forget or you aren't able to find it. And then a couple Trailhead modules that you might want to check out. These are the 3 that I did before stepping into Lightning. This is my my first Lightning component that I've built, and these 3 were very useful. So the Lightning App Builder, to give you an idea of what you get on the front end. The Lightning Design System was a great one to figure out how to make it look more Lightning-y. And then Lightning Component Basics, how to build your first Lightning component. So I really encourage you to try to embrace this configurable-driven design. If you do this, now whenever I need to add an enhancement to that component or anything I build like that, I don't have to do it. We can just give it to an admin, and they can configure it as much as they like, all on the front end. And when you do that, when you build with this mindset, you're not maintaining anymore. You're extending and enhancing. When I first built that component, all it did was display the data. The next time I visited it is to add another feature where I could make the links accessible. And then I added another feature where you can make the links, you can edit the links or edit the records that are on those links. Those are just enhancements, because every time the usage changed, they just edited the report itself, and I didn't have to do anything. And when you get to that mindset, you start to leverage the true power of Salesforce. I used to believe that Salesforce was really just a fancy database, but really you get all of this stuff for free, where you can just extend the system and leverage the things that Salesforce is building that they're giving you for free. Well, free in the sense that you're our customer and you don't have to build yourself. And lastly, if you do want to contact me, you can check out my blog at socoldprogrammer.com, where I try to blog about similar ideas that I have built out in the past. And you can also follow me on Twitter at SquizzleFlip. Don't ask. It was like a high school joke, and it just kind of stuck for the next 20 years. And I don't really tweet that often, but if I had more followers, maybe I would. So, all right, so I'll open it up to questions. We only have a couple minutes, but if you want to chat afterwards, if you have any questions right now, let me know. Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for visiting me, and I'll have a safe trip home.